Ambassador Bolton, what is your assessment of where things are 12 months in?
Well, I think the results are mixed. And I think, frankly, the West has spent too much time patting itself on the back. Right now, Russia has twice the territory in Ukraine that it had before February 24th of last year. It has certainly suffered enormous casualties. There's no doubt about it. But in the Russian calculus, human life isn't worth as much to them as it is to us. And as long as Russia has the capacity to wage war, every indication is the war will continue. We have not provided adequate weaponry to the Ukrainians. We do not have a strategy to win. We have been responding to various requests from Ukraine, but it really endangers support for the war, at least in the United States, when we're afraid to say conclusively that our objectives are the removal of all Russian troops and the restoration of full Ukrainian territorial and integrity and sovereignty, meaning including the Crimea. If you're not willing to say that, if as US leaders do and others, well, we're leaving that up to the Ukrainians, I hope people will understand that saying that is the creation of a blank check for Ukraine. And the isolationists in the United States make exactly that point. So I don't see why, if it's the official position, and long has been, the government of the United States, the government of the United Kingdom, the government of every NATO member, we don't say publicly, our objective is getting all Russian troops out of Ukraine instead of Crimea. Then from that, you can develop a strategy. Then you decide what weapon systems you need. You don't argue about javelins or HIMARS or ATACMS or tanks or F-16s unless you know what your objective is.
And do you think the objective that you've just set out, do you think that is the objective that President Zelensky has in mind as well, and indeed the wider Ukrainian public?
Well, I think it is. I think he needs to say it more often too. I think the hope of this, well, we're not going to get out in front of Ukraine. We're going to listen to what the Ukrainians say, was a dodge by some European countries, hoping they could force the Ukrainians to accept less than the total withdrawal of Russian forces. And this goes back. I mean, we're on the 1-year anniversary, to be clear, of Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. And the fact is that NATO, and I mean the United States in the lead, and every other country in the NATO alliance, performed pathetically weakly in response to the first invasion. So to restore NATO's credibility, to restore the deterrence that we all need to prevent aggressive warfare in the first place, we've got to go back to where we were before 2014.
And in terms of NATO's involvement, can you ever see a more aggressive level of intervention from NATO? And is that what you would like to see to bring this to an end?
Well, we are in a war because a country that's vital to security and stability in Europe was attacked without provocation by Russia. Let's face it, levels of certainly American forces in Europe, and frankly, levels of every other NATO member are far lower than they were during the Cold War. The West succumbed at the end of the Soviet Union to the delusion that the history had ended. We had a peace dividend. Globalization was going to take over. Sweetness and light would prevail around the world. They didn't give the memo to the fellows in the Kremlin. Or to the people in Beijing either. And it's time for people to wake up. We need substantially greater defense expenditures across the board. The 2% NATO target is inadequate. It ought to be 3% or 4% of GDP. The United States alone, in the weaponry we've provided Ukraine in 1 year, has deplenished our arsenals to the point where I think we should be worried about what we're going to do if there's a contingency involving a Chinese threat to Taiwan or a threat to the United States elsewhere in the world. The notion that we can have defense and deterrence on the cheap has been brutally destroyed by Russia's aggression. Let's learn the lesson. It's right in front of us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're having very similar discussions here in the United Kingdom right now. We've got a big budget coming up about what the settlement will be for our Ministry of Defence. I think many of my listeners will agree with you. So, Ambassador Bolton, just taking a step back, in your mind, how does this thing end? Does it end?
Well, I don't see an end in the near term because Ukraine right now does not have the capability to push Russian forces out of its country. So we'll dribble them out over a period of time. The fact is that while Russian military casualties are certainly higher than Ukraine's have not been insubstantial. We actually probably have a better idea of Russia's casualties than we do Ukraine's, including civilian casualties. I think they're probably more extensive than the public figure, and I think that reflects the pressure on Ukraine. Uh, Certainly, Russia's efforts to destroy uh, the capital structure of Ukraine, destroy its electrical generating capability, destroy the port of Mariupol, destroy whatever territory they take control of, is going to mean a huge cost of reconstruction at some point. So, this war of attrition can go on for a long time. Generally speaking, in wars of attrition, the bigger country wins. Russia is 3.5 or 4 times bigger than Ukraine. Do the math. Time is on Russia's side. So I come back to my first point. Let's state what our objectives are. Let's develop a strategy to achieve those objectives, and let's do it in a timely fashion. Are we content to let this war go on another 20 years? I don't think so. 10 years? I don't think so. 5 years? I don't think so. Let's win the war. If that's what our objective is, let's tell the people of our countries what they need to do, and let's get on with it.
And let's say that strategy is adopted by people where people are upfront about that core objective. And many people will be sympathetic to that because, of course, the cost of this war is impacting on many of NATO's societies and economies. What does that mean in terms of weaponry? What does that mean in terms of additional measures that NATO should take?
Well, I think that substantial additional resources are going to be necessary. I think the West, and I will blame the United States first, has been intimidated by the Russians with the threat of an expanded war. If we help defend Ukraine from being invaded, that we're the ones committing aggression by defending Ukraine's territorial integrity. Well, where's this hidden army that the Russians are going to use? Where has Putin been keeping it? And if it's such a good army, why isn't it in Ukraine today? We're intimidated by the threat of tactical nuclear weapons. I think for 1 year, Putin has bluffed. It's been entirely an effort to psych out the United States and the West, and it's succeeded. I think we need to make it clear to the Russians generally that any use of tactical nuclear weapons would result in devastating retaliation, including a direct attack on Vladimir Putin's life personally. Now, if there's a better way to deter Putin, I'm happy to hear about it. But what I'm looking for is the most convincing argument to convince the Russians that they can just leave their tactical nuclear weapons in their arsenals where they are now.
That's really, really interesting. And what do you think is going on in President Putin's mind now, Ambassador Bolton? Because, a lot of the narrative, certainly outside, I mean, of course, the press is very controlled in Russia, but people have been quite surprised at how Russia has underperformed. Do you think there's any chance of any sort of, retreat in President Putin's mind, or is he all in now?
Well, I think he's all in now, but I do think that the so-called Chinese peace plan that's emerging may be a face-saving gesture for him to get what Russia could benefit from even more than Ukraine, which is a ceasefire in place to allow the Russians to regroup. And maybe over a long period of time, whatever that new ceasefire is, if the Ukrainians agree to it, could become the new border of Ukraine and Russia, which is entirely to Russia's advantage at this point. And then in 5 years or 6 years, then the Russians come at them again. We should not be focused only on the hostilities immediately in front of us, but on the longer term threat from Russia and the news that we've heard over the past week that it looks like China may be preparing to ship weapons directly to Russia. This is not a European war anymore. This is a global war, and the Chinese-Russian entente is more and more visible. So people in Europe in particular who say, well, China is just a big market for us, heaven forbid that we should take strong steps against China, wake up. It's here. China is not just a threat to Taiwan. The country most at threat from China today is Ukraine.
And final question to you, Ambassador. Were you surprised at how resilient Ukraine has proved to be, its military force, the spirit of its people? And also what a strong leader President Zelensky has turned out to be.
Well, I think the Ukrainian military and civilian populations have performed in an outstanding fashion. I think Zelensky is a hero to his country and an inspiration to the West. I think we vastly overestimated the Russian capabilities. So to be clear, in the list of Western failures, which we should note along with our successes, the intelligence failure is very significant, because sometimes you can overestimate an enemy's capabilities, and sometimes you can underestimate them. So getting the intelligence right in anticipation of future conflicts, I think, should be an extraordinarily high priority for the entire NATO alliance.
Ambassador Bolton, we're really grateful for your time. Thank you for speaking with Times Radio.